The sky was burning. Ambassador Soreth Vel stood at the narrow observation slit of the underground bunker and watched the world he had known for 300 years die. Great pillars of fire rose from the capital city above, twisting into the smoke-choked sky like the fingers of some terrible god reaching upward. Every few seconds another blast shook the ground beneath his feet, sending dust raining from the ceiling and causing the lights to flicker. The Velari home world, a planet that had known peace for over 2,000 years, was being torn apart. Sarah was old, even by the standards of his long-lived species. His skin, once a deep and healthy blue, had faded to a pale gray over the centuries. His 4 eyes, once sharp enough to read star charts from across a room, now squinted against the dust. His robes, the white ceremonial garments of the High Council, were torn and stained with dirt and something darker that he did not want to think about. He looked nothing like an ambassador anymore. He looked like what he was, a survivor, and barely that. The bunker was deep beneath the council hall, or what was left of it. It had been built centuries ago, during a time when the Velari still remembered what war looked like. That memory had faded long ago. The Velari had chosen the path of diplomacy, of wisdom, of patient conversation over conflict. They had brokered peace between the Irani Collective and the Dravani Federation. They had mediated the Shimmer Wars of the Nissi courts. They had talked and listened and negotiated, and for 2,000 years it had worked. It was not working now. The Kree Dominion had come without warning, for their fleet had appeared at the edge of the system like a dark cloud rolling over a clear sky. Hundreds of warships, then thousands, blotting out the stars as they moved into formation around the planet. The Velari had attempted to open a dialogue. They had sent greetings, peace offerings, requests for negotiation. The Kree had responded with orbital bombardment. The planetary defense turrets, old, poorly maintained things that had not been fired in living memory, had held for almost 6 hours. That was longer than anyone expected, but one by one they had gone silent, their crews dead or their systems destroyed, until the sky belonged entirely to the enemy. Now the Seer were landing ground forces. Soreth turned away from the observation slit and walked slowly down the corridor to the main operations room. It was a small space. We never meant to hold more than a dozen people, but it was packed with nearly 40. Most of them were civilians, council staff, maintenance workers, few children who had been in the building when the attack began. They sat against the walls with blank faces, some crying quietly, some simply staring at nothing. A few of the older Velari had closed all 4 of their eyes and were murmuring the old prayers, the ones that had not been spoken seriously in centuries. In the center of the room, surrounded by flickering screens and dying equipment, sat 3 people who were still working. 2 of them were senior communications officers. The third was a young woman named Lith. Lith was barely 40 years old, which made her practically a child by Velari standards. She had been assigned to the Council's communications department only 6 months ago, a junior officer on her first real posting. She had thin blue skin, large, nervous eyes, and hands that had not stopped shaking since the first bombs fell, but she was still at her station. She was still working. Soreth respected that more than he could say. Report, Soreth said quietly, stepping up behind Her lip swallowed hard, the same as before. Ambassador, all channels to the Irani collective are dead. The Dravani Federation relay stations went offline 4 hours ago. The Nisi courts. She hesitated. We received a partial transmission from them 2 hours ago. It was a distress call. They are under attack as well. Surith closed his eyes. All of them. The Kree planned this. Yes. Ambassador, it appears they launched simultaneous attacks on every major allied civilization. Our intelligence suggests the Kree have been positioning their fleets in secret for months, possibly years. By the time any of us realized what was happening, it was already too late. The other two officers, an older man named Vorin and a middle-aged woman named Azala, both nodded grimly. Voron pulled up a star map on one of the few remaining working screens. It showed the known galaxy with the territories of the various allied species marked in different colors. One by one, those colors were going dark. The Irani home world fell approximately 8 hours ago, Vin said. His voice was flat, the voice of a man who had already processed his grief and moved past it into something cold and empty. The Dravani are fighting, but their fleet was caught in dark. They will not hold. The Nalisi have retreated to their inner systems, but the Kree are pursuing the smaller species, the Alari, the Fen, the Tavoshi. We have heard nothing from any of them. Nothing at all. Soreth asked. Nothing. They are either destroyed or they have gone silent. Soreth stood very still for a long moment. Around him, the bunker shook again as another blast hit somewhere above. Dust fell. A child began to cry, and someone hushed it gently. Is there anyone left to contact? Soreth asked. He already knew the answer, but he needed to hear it spoken aloud. Tala shook her head. We have exhausted every known diplomatic channel, every military frequency, every emergency contact in our records. Every species we have a relationship with is either under attack, destroyed, when, or unreachable. We are alone, Ambassador. The word hung in the air like smoke. Alone. Soreth had spent his entire career making sure the Velari were never alone. He had woven a web of alliances and friendships that spanned the galaxy. He had believed, truly and deeply believed, that this web would protect them, that if the worst ever came, they would have friends to call on, allies who would come to their aid, just as the Velari had so often aided others. That web was gone, cut apart in a single coordinated strike by an enemy who had studied it carefully and knew exactly where to cut. Sarah sank into a chair. For the first time in his 300 years, he felt truly old. It was Lith who spoke next, and what she said changed the course of galactic history. Ambassador, she said, her voice small and hesitant, there is and one more contact in the database. Sarah looked at her. What do you mean? Lith was pulling up a file on her screen, digging through layers of old records that had clearly not been accessed in a very long time. When I was running through the emergency contacts, I went all the way to the bottom of the list, past the allied species, past the neutral observers, past even the minor civilizations we have only met once or twice. At the very bottom in the archive section, there is a contact frequency for a species that was registered after a single diplomatic meeting approximately 30 standard years ago. What species? Soreth asked. Lith found the file and opened it. She read from the screen, her brow furrowed. They are called humans, from a planet called Earth, in an unremarkable yellow star System on the outer edge of the galactic. Arm, the file says we made contact with them during a routine border survey. There was a single meeting, the notes described them as she paused reading. Pregalactic, emotionally volatile. Technologically primitive by galactic standards of minor interest. She looked up at Soreth, the officer who wrote the report recommended no further contact. Soreth remembered. It came back to him like a dream, a memory from decades ago, when the galaxy had still seemed safe and orderly. A small strange ship had appeared near one of the Velari border stations. It was clumsy and slow, clearly the product of a civilization that had only recently figured out how to travel between stars. The beings inside had been odd, soft-skinned, bipedal with only 2 eyes and a bewildering range of facial expressions. They had been loud and excitable, asking too many questions, touching everything, laughing at things that were not funny. One of them had grabbed Sora's hand and shaken it vigorously, a custom from their world that apparently signified greeting. Sarah remembered the strange warmth of the creature's grip, the way it had smiled at him with its flat teeth, the way its eyes had been wide with wonder. He also remembered how the meeting had ended. The Velari delegation had politely told the humans that they were not yet ready to participate in galactic affairs. They had given them a contact frequency as a formality, patted them on the head, metaphorically speaking, and sent them on their way. And the humans had seemed disappointed, but had accepted the decision with surprising grace. That had been 30 years ago. The Velari had never contacted them again. Humans, Sareth said quietly. I remember them. Should I try the frequency? Lith asked. Vine made a dismissive sound. What would be the point? A pregalactic species with primitive technology. Even if they received the signal, what could they possibly do? Send us their thoughts and prayers, Voron Tala said gently. There is no one else. That simple truth settled over the room like a blanket. There was no one else. Every great civilization they had ever known was burning or silent. The mighty fleets of the Irani, the brilliant strategists of the Dravani, the ancient wisdom of the Nissi, all of it was gone or going, and here they were at the bottom of the contact list, looking at the name of a species they had dismissed as irrelevant. Soreth looked at Lith. Send the signal. Lith nodded. Her fingers moved across the console, pulling up the old frequency, calibrating the transmitter to cut through the interference from the bombardment above. She worked quickly and precisely, and Soreth noticed that her hands had stopped shaking. Having a task, even a hopeless one, seemed to steady her. What should I say, Ambassador? She asked. Sora thought for a moment, then he spoke, and Lith typed as he dictated. We are the Velari. We are under attack by the Kree Dominion. Our world is burning. Our allies have fallen. We have no fleet, no army, no weapons. We have called every friend we have, and no one can answer. We are dying. If anyone among humanity can hear this, Ada, we beg you, we have no one left. Please help us. Lith read it back. Sorith nodded. She translated it into the crude human language they had on file. English, the humans had called it, and transmitted it on the old frequency. The signal left the bunker's antenna, punched through the smoke and fire above. The planet slipped past the Kree warships in orbit and raced out into the darkness of space at the speed of light. It was a tiny thing, a whisper. The vast emptiness between stars, aimed at a species that probably did not even remember the Velari existed. Sarah sat back in his chair and waited. He did not expect an answer. He had done this because it was the last thing he could do, and doing something felt better than doing nothing. Around him, the bunker continued to shake. The lights flickered. The child who had been crying earlier had fallen asleep in its mother's arms. Lith stared at her screen. Minutes passed. 1, 2, 3. The silence was heavy and complete, broken only by the distant rumble of explosions. Above, Ambassador Buren said softly, "Perhaps we should begin discussing evacuation options for the civilians. If we can reach the underground transit tunnels, there may be." Ambassador Lith's voice cut through the room like a knife. It was sharp and high and trembling, but not with fear, with something else entirely. Everyone looked at her. Lith was staring at her screen with all four of her eyes wide open, wider than Sarah had ever seen on a Velari face. Her mouth was slightly open. Her hands were pressed flat on the console as if she needed something solid to hold on to. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "Aim your response," Lith whispered. "We have a response." The room went absolutely silent. Even the crying and the praying stopped. Every person in that bunker turned to look at the young communications officer, and the words glowing on her screen. Sareth stood and walked to her station. He looked at the screen. The message was short, written in plain English text, and it had arrived just 7 minutes after their distress call was sent. 7 minutes. That meant either the humans were impossibly close, or they had technology that the Velari had never imagined. The message read, "Signal received. Hold your position. We are coming. UNCC Seoul. Command." Sareth read it 3 times. Then he read it a 4th time because he was not sure he believed what he was seeing. "UNSC," Lith said, her voice barely above a whisper. "One United Nations Space Command. That is a military designation." "Ambassador." "Military," Sareth repeated. The word felt strange in his mouth when applied to the small, loud, handshaking creatures he remembered from 30 years ago. "The humans have a military, it would appear so," Lith said. Varen leaned over Lith's shoulder, frowning. "Hold your position. We are coming." He shook his head slowly. "Coming with what?" "A handful of patrol ships, a science vessel. What could they possibly?" Another rumble shook the bunker harder. This time, dust poured from the ceiling. One of the screens cracked and went dark. Somewhere above them, the CFT were getting closer. Sarah placed a hand on Lith's shoulder. She looked up at him. "Send a reply," he said. "Tell them thank you. Tell them our coordinates. Tell them." He paused, uprun in his voice almost broke. "Tell them to hurry." Lith sent the message, and then they waited. Above them, the Kree Dominion continued to burn their world. Ground troops were moving through the ruins of the capital, their heavy boots crunching over rubble that had once been libraries and gardens, and homes where families had lived for generations. Kree commanders reported to Warlord Draxus high above in his flagship that resistance was minimal. The Velari had no soldiers, no weapons. It was, the commander said, almost disappointing. Draxus sat in his command chair and watched his empire grow. He had spent 10 years planning this, the simultaneous destruction of every civilization that might oppose the Dominion's expansion. It had required patience, something the Kree were not known for, but Draxus was different from his predecessors, he understood that the key to conquering a galaxy was not just strength but timing, strike everywhere at once, and no one can come to anyone else's aid. It had worked perfectly. Irani were conquered, the Dravani were falling, the Nalisi were running, and the Velari, the great diplomats, the weavers of alliances, they were helpless, their precious web of friends and treaties had amounted to nothing. When the moment of truth arrived, Draxus allowed himself a rare smile. By tomorrow, the Velari home world would be another territory of the Dominion, and there was not a single force in the galaxy that could stop him. He was wrong about that. Deep in the bunker, Lith's screen blinked one more time. A second message, shorter than the first. She read it, and something happened to her face that Sareth had never seen on a Velari before. It took him a moment to recognize the expression because it was so foreign to his people, so alien to their nature. It was hope. The message read: ETA 14 hours, fleet size classified, hold the line, Admiral Tanaka, 1st Expeditionary Fleet, UNSC. Fleet. The humans had a fleet. Sareth looked at the message. He looked at Lith. He looked around the bunker at the frightened faces of his people, the civilians, the children, the old ones, who were praying. 14 hours they needed to survive. For 14 hours, he straightened his torn robes, he lifted his chin, and, for the first time since the sky began to burn, Ambassador Sareth Vel of the Velari High Council allowed himself to believe that this was not the end. 14 hours, and they could hold for 14 hours. They had to. 14 hours before the fleet arrived at Velar Prime. Admiral Kira Tanaka was sleeping. She slept the way all military officers learned to sleep. Quickly, lightly, and fully clothed, her quarters aboard the UNCC Thermopylae were small and plain, nothing like what most people imagined when they thought of a fleet admiral's cabin. A narrow bed bolted to the wall, a desk with a single lamp, a photograph in a metal frame showing a woman and 2 children standing on a beach somewhere on Earth, squinting into the sun and smiling. The walls were bare steel. The air smelled of recycled oxygen and coffee. The alarm hit at 300 hours ship time. Tanaka was on her feet before the second pulse. She was a small woman, compact and lean, with short black hair that was going gray at the temples and dark eyes that had a way of looking through people rather than at them. She was 52 years old, and she had spent 30 of those years in the UNC, climbing from a junior navigation officer on a patrol frigate to the commander of the most powerful military force humanity had ever assembled. She did not look impressive. She looked tired, but everyone who had ever served under her knew that behind those tired eyes was a mind that never stopped working. She hit the comm panel on her wall. Tanaka here. The voice on the other end belonged to Captain James Parker, Chief of Staff. He was calm as always, but there was something underneath his calm that Tanaka recognized immediately. Excitement. Controlled, disciplined excitement, on the kind that military officers feel when something they have been preparing for their entire lives suddenly becomes real. Admiral, we have received a Priority 1 distress call on an old diplomatic frequency. It is from the Velari. Tanaka paused with her boots half on the. She knew the name as every senior UNC officer did. The tall blue aliens who had made contact with humanity 30 years ago exchanged polite greetings and then essentially told them to go home and grow up. The encounter had been brief and somewhat humiliating, and it had been classified at the highest levels, not because it was shameful, but because of what humanity had decided to do about it. Put it through, Tanaka said. She read the message on her desk screen. It was short and desperate, warning that it was written in a version of English that was slightly off, as if it had been translated by someone working from a very old dictionary. But the meaning was clear. We are dying. We have no one left. Please help us. Tanaka read it twice, then she sat down at her desk and pulled up everything the UNC had on the Kree Dominion. The files were thick. Humanity had been watching the Kree for a very long time. This was the part of the story that the galaxy did not know, the part that would later cause every alien species in known space to look at humanity with new eyes and, in some cases, new fear. After the Velari had sent them home 30 years ago, humanity had not sulked. They had not given up on space or turned inward or accepted their place as a minor, irrelevant species on the edge of the galaxy. Instead, they had looked at the universe with clear eyes and asked a simple question: what is actually out there? The answer had frightened them. Humanity's first deep space probe, sent out in secret in the years following the Velari contact, had painted a picture of a galaxy that was beautiful and vast and extremely dangerous. They had detected the Velari and their allies peaceful, advanced, and completely unprepared for real war. They had detected the Kree Dominion, aggressive, expansionist, and growing stronger every year. They had run the numbers. They had built models and simulations, and every single model, every single simulation had come to the same conclusion: sooner or later, the CH would attack. And when they did, the peaceful species of the galaxy would have no way to stop them. Humanity had two choices. They could build defenses around their own system, hide behind their own borders, and hope the CRT never noticed them, or they could prepare for something bigger. They chose bigger. The decision was made at the highest levels of the United Nations in meetings that were never recorded and never leaked. The project was given a simple name: Operation Shepherd. Its goal was equally simple: build a fleet capable of fighting full-scale galactic war and keep it secret until it was needed. It took 30 years. The shipyards were hidden in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Hollowed out rocks the size of small moons converted into construction facilities. More yards were built in the shadow of Jupiter's moons, shielded from detection by the planet's massive magnetic field. Saturn's rings hid supply depots, Neptune's orbit concealed training grounds where entire battle groups conducted exercises in the frozen dark. The ships they built were not elegant. The galaxy's other species built beautiful vessels, sleek, curved, shimmering things that looked like they had been designed by artists. Human ships looked like they had been designed by people who expected to get punched in the face. They were blocky and angular, and covered in thick armor plating. They bristled with weapons, missile tubes, railgun batteries, point defense systems, and things that had no equivalent in any other species' arsenal. They were ugly, they were brutal, and they were built to survive. The UNCC had studied every piece of intelligence they could gather on galactic warfare. They had analyzed the weapons, tactics, and strategies of every known species, and they had found a gap: A blind spot that every alien civilization shared. No one in the galaxy fought up close. Galactic warfare as practiced by every species humanity had observed was a long-range affair. Ships stood off at great distances and exchanged fire with energy, weapons and guided missiles. It was orderly and predictable and almost polite. No one boarded enemy ships. No one engaged in close-quarters combat. No one was crazy enough to fly a fighter craft into the gap between two capital ships and attack from point-blank range. Humanity looked at this and smiled, because close-quarters violence was something humans understood very, very well. They built fighters, small, fast, incredibly agile craft piloted by men and women who had been selected for their reflexes and their comfort with extreme danger. They built Marine Division soldiers empowered exoskeleton suits trained to breach airlocks, storm corridors, and take enemy ships from the inside. They built electronic warfare systems that could blind an enemy sensors and communications at close range. They built torpedoes designed to be fired at distances so short that no other species would even consider it survivable, and they trained for 30 years. They trained. Admiral Tanaka had been part of it from the beginning. She had joined the UNCC as a young woman who had read the classified briefings on the crest and felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had risen through the ranks, not because she was the strongest or the loudest, but because she was the smartest, a strategist who could see 3 moves ahead, who could look at a battle map and know with an almost frightening certainty what the enemy was going to do next. Now she sat at her desk reading a distress call from a species that had once told humanity it was not ready, and she felt that cold feeling in her stomach again, but this time it was mixed with something else. Purpose. She opened a fleet-wide channel. All captains, this is Admiral Tanaka. Report to the flag bridge for immediate briefing. This is not a drill. The Thermopylae was the flagship of the first expeditionary fleet, and it was enormous. It was a dreadnought-class carrier over 3 km long, carrying a crew of 8,000 and an air wing of 400 fighters. It was armored so heavily that it could survive direct hits from weapons that would tear most alien warships in half. Its name was chosen deliberately, Thermopylae, the hot gates wick, the place where a small force had once held the line against an overwhelming enemy so that others might survive. Humanity had a habit of naming its ships after last stands: the Thermopylae, the Alamo, the Masada, the Roar's Drift. It said something about the species that they considered their most inspiring moments to be the ones where they were outnumbered and outgunned and refused to quit. Within 30 minutes, every captain in the fleet was on the flag bridge, either in person or via holographic link. There were over 200 of them, commanding everything from massive dreadnoughts to fast destroyers to stealth frigates. They were men and women of every race and nationality on Earth, united by the same uniform and the same oath. They stood at attention and waited. Tanaka did not waste time. She put the Velari distress call on the main screen and let them read it. Then she put up the intelligence data on the Kree Dominion's attack, the simultaneous strikes, the fallen civilizations, the scale of the destruction. As of 3 hours ago, Tanaka said, the Kree Dominion has launched a coordinated attack on every major allied civilization in known space. The Irani collective has fallen The Dravani Federation is under siege. The Nelisi courts are in retreat. The Velari home world is under orbital bombardment and ground invasion. Every species the Velari called for help has either been destroyed or is unable to respond. She paused. The bridge was silent. They called us. We are the last contact in their database. They called us because there was literally no one else left to call. She looked at her captains. Some of them were young, barely 30, with the eager tension of people who had trained their whole lives for a moment that was finally here. Others were older, veterans of the long secret buildup, men and women who had spent decades preparing for a war they sometimes feared would never come. All of them were watching her with the same expression. Ready. I'm not going to give a long speech, Tanaka said. You have all been briefed on the Kree. You know what they are, you know what they do to the species they conquer, and you know what we built this fleet for. She straightened. The Velari never gave us anything, no technology, no trade, no alliance. They told us we were not ready and sent us home. Some of you might think that means we owe them nothing. She let that hang in the air for a moment, but that is not how we do things where I come from. When someone calls for help, you answer. It does not matter if they are your friend. It does not matter if they ever did anything for you. It does not matter if they once looked down on you. They are in trouble. They are dying. They called us and we are going to answer. She pulled up the navigation data on the main screen. The route to the Velari system was plotted in a clean blue line across the star map. The first expeditionary fleet will depart in 90 minutes, all ships full combat readiness. We will arrive in the Velari system in approximately 14 hours. When we get there, we are going to break the Kree fleet, liberate the planet, and show the galaxy that there is a price for attacking the defenseless. She looked at them one last time. This is what we were made for. Go to your ships. May get your people ready. Dismissed. The captains moved. There was no hesitation, no debate, no voices raised. In doubt, they simply went, and as they went, something passed between them. Current of energy, of determination, of something that was almost joy, not the joy of violence, but the joy of purpose. Every single one of them had spent years wondering if the day would ever come. It had come. Within an hour, the fleet was moving. It was a sight that no human eye had ever seen before, because no human fleet of this size had ever existed before. Ships launched from the hidden docks in the asteroid belt, rising out of hollowed-out rocks like silver fish. Emerging from dark caves, more ships came from Jupiter's moons, from Saturn's hidden depots, from the training grounds near Neptune, and they gathered in formation, dreadnoughts at the center, carriers behind them, destroyers and frigates on the flanks, and swarms of fighter craft tucked into their launch bays like sleeping wasps. The final count was staggering. Over 12,000 warships, 400,000 fighters, 2 million Marines, supply ships, hospital ships, repair tenders, communication relays. The entire support structure of a civilization that had spent 3 decades preparing for exactly this moment. Earth watched them go. Departure was not secret. There was no point in secrecy now. Across the planet, people stood outside and looked up at the sky and watched the lights of the fleet streak across the darkness. Some cheered, some cried, some simply stood in silence, knowing that many of those lights would not come back. On the Thermopyla's bridge, Hontanaka stood, with her hands clasped behind her back, and watched the fleet fall into formation around her. Captain Park stood beside her, a data pad in his hand. Fleet reports. All ships at combat. Readiness, Admiral, he said. FTL. Drives are charged. Navigation is locked. We are ready to go on your order. Tanaka nodded. She thought about the Velari in their bunker, 14 hours away, waiting in the dark for help that they probably did not believe was really coming. She thought about the Kree, confident in their power, certain that no one was left to challenge them. She thought about the crew of the Thermopylae and the crews of 12,000 other ships, all of them about to fly into the unknown, toward an enemy they had never actually fought. Fleet command to all ships, she said. Her voice was calm and steady. The voice of a woman who had been waiting for this moment for 30 years. Engage FTL drives. Take us to Velar Prime. The fleet jumped. 12,000 ships vanished from human space in a ripple of light that was visible from the surface of Earth, a brief flash across the night sky that was there and then gone. On the ground, people looked up and wondered. In orbit, the silence that followed was enormous. 14 hours, that was how long the Velari needed to hold, far away in a bunker beneath a burning world. Ambassador Sorath sat in his chair and stared at the message on Lith's screen. We are coming, 2 words from a species he barely remembered, a species his people had dismissed as unimportant, species that had no reason at all to help. Do you think they are real? Varen asked. He was standing by the wall, arms crossed. Yuri, his face skeptical. Do you think they are actually coming? Sorath did not answer immediately. He was thinking about the human he had met 30 years ago, the one who had grabbed his hand and shaken it, who had smiled with those flat teeth, who had looked at him with eyes full of wonder and warmth. He remembered how the human had said goodbye, not with the formal, distant courtesy of the other galactic species, but with a strange informality that had felt almost intimate. See you around, the human had said, as if they fully expected to meet again, as if the galaxy was small enough for that. Yes, Sora said quietly, I think they are coming. Above them, the CFT continued their work. Ground troops moved through the city in methodical lines, securing districts, rounding up survivors, and cataloging resources for extraction. Harath officers reported to their commanders that the planet was nearly pacified. There was no meaningful resistance. The operation was proceeding ahead of schedule. In orbit, Warlord Draxus reviewed the reports with satisfaction. The Velari home world would be fully under Dominion control within 48 hours. After that, he would move on to mop up the remaining Dravani resistance and hunt down the fleeing Nissi. Within a year, the entire region of the galaxy would belong to the Kree. No one could stop them. No one was left. He did not notice the slight anomaly that appeared briefly on the long-grain sensors, a flicker of energy far outside the system, moving fast then gone. One of his sensor officers noted it, considered reporting it, and then decided it was probably a natural phenomenon, a solar flare perhaps, and/or a comet passing through an energy field. It was not a comet, it was 12,000 warships traveling faster than anything the galaxy had ever tracked, and they were coming straight for him. The Kree had studied every species in the galaxy. They had analyzed every fleet, every weapon, every strategy. They had planned their great assault with the precision of surgeons accounting for every possible variable. They had not accounted for humanity. No one had in the bunker. Lith suddenly sat up straighter. Her console was picking up something faint, distant but growing. Energy signatures, thousands of them, moving through FTL space on a direct course for the Velari system. The signatures were unlike anything in the Velari database. They were rough and powerful, like the heartbeat of some enormous machine. "Hey, Ambassador," Leith said. Her voice was very quiet and very steady, and very different from the frightened girl who had sent the distress call hours ago. "I am reading incoming FTL signatures, long range. Many of them." Sorath stood. "How many?" Lith ran the scan again, then a third time, because she did not believe the number. "Ambassador," she said, and her voice cracked, "I think they sent everything. 12 hours remained, then 10, then 8. In the darkness between stars, the fleet of the United Nations Space Command roared toward Velar Prime, and aboard every ship in every corridor and cabin and fighter bay, men and women prepared for war. On the bridge of the Thermopylae, Admiral Tanaka stood and watched the countdown timer on the main screen. 6 hours 42. She opened a channel to the fleet. Her voice was the last thing her people would hear before they dropped out of FTL into a battle that would change the galaxy forever. "All hands. This is Admiral Tanaka. We are 2 hours from arrival. When we drop out of FTL, we will be facing the full might of the Kree Dominion fleet. They do not know we are coming. They do not know who we are. They do not know what we can do." She paused. "Show them." And across 12,000 ships, 2 million voices answered as one. The Kree sensor officer was the first to see them. His name was not important. He was a junior technician aboard the Kree flagship Dominance, assigned to the long-range detection station on the Nightwa Watch. It was considered a dull posting. The Velari system was conquered. There was nothing left to detect. He had been half asleep at his console, if thinking about the promotion he would receive after this campaign, when his screen suddenly filled with light. He blinked. He leaned forward. He ran the scan again. Then he ran it a third time, because what he was seeing was impossible. "Commander," he said, and his voice came out wrong too high, too fast. "Commander, I am reading incoming signatures at the system edge. FTL exits, many of them. The Watch." Commander walked over, irritated at being disturbed. He looked at the screen. His irritation vanished. "How many?" he asked. The sensor officer swallowed. "Thousands, Commander. The computer is still counting. It cannot determine an exact number. There are too many." The Watch commander stared at the screen for 3 seconds. Then he hit the alarm. The sound that filled the Dominance was a deep, wimp, pulsing tone that every Kree knew from birth. It was the sound of danger. It had not been sounded on a Kree flagship in over a century, because no one had been foolish enough to challenge the Dominion in that long. Across the Kree fleet, nearly 3,000 warships hanging in orbit above the Velari home world. The alarm spread. Crews scrambled to battle stations. Weapons powered up, shields activated. Warlord Draxus was pulled from his rest and brought to the command bridge, where his officers were staring at the main display with expressions he had never seen on Kree faces before. "Fear report." Draxus said he was a massive figure, even by Kree standards, nearly 3 m tall, with thick gray skin and forearms that ended in hands capable of crushing metal. His voice was deep and cold and utterly controlled. He had conquered 11 species. He did not feel fear, not yet, Warlord. An unknown fleet is exiting FTL at the system boundary. His tactical officer said, "We are counting 12,000 signatures. And rising, they are in combat formation. They are heading directly for us." 12,000. Draxus had 3,000 ships. He had considered this an overwhelming force because it was 3,000 CE warships was enough to crush any fleet in the galaxy. No species had ever assembled more than a few hundred warships in one place. The idea that someone could gather 12,000 was not just surprising. It was supposed to be impossible. "Identify them," Draxus ordered. His officers tried. They ran the incoming signatures through every database the Dominion possessed: Irani ship profiles, Dravani engine signatures, Anile energy patterns. Nothing matched. The incoming ships were something entirely new. "We have no match, Warlord," the tactical officer said. "These ships do not correspond to any known species." Draxus narrowed his eyes. "Then who are they?" The answer came a moment later. Not from his own officers, but from the unknown fleet itself. A transmission broadcast on all frequencies in perfect Cree language. Someone had done their homework. "This is Admiral Kira Tanaka of the United Nations Space Command. You are engaged in the unlawful destruction of a sovereign species. You have one chance to withdraw your forces from the system. There will not be a second warning." The bridge was silent. Draxus looked at the main display where the incoming fleet was now visible as a wall of blue dots spreading across the system. Like a rising tide, each dot was a warship. There were so many dots that the display was having trouble rendering them all. "United Nations Space Command," Draxus repeated slowly. Humans, he knew the name somewhere in the Dominion's vast intelligence archives. There was a file on a minor species from an unremarkable star system, pre-galactic, primitive, not a threat. The file was 30 years old. A lot can happen in 30 years. Draxus considered the situation with the cold, calculating mind that had won him 11 conquests. 12,000 ships was a significant number, but numbers alone did not win battles. These humans were untested. They had never fought a real war against a galactic power. Their ships were unknown. Their tactics were unknown. Their capabilities were unknown. They could be bluffing if they could be sending empty transports with military transponders to inflate their numbers. It would not be the first time a desperate species had tried such a trick. "Ignore the transmission," Draxus said. "All ships engage the enemy." It was the last order Warlord Draxus would give as a free being. The two fleets met at the edge of the Velari system, and the battle that followed would be studied by military scholars of every species for centuries to come. The CH called it a disaster. The Velari called it a miracle. Humanity called it the Battle of Velar Prime, and it changed everything. The Kree attacked the way they always attacked, with overwhelming firepower at long range. Their ships formed into their standard battle lines and opened fire with energy cannons and guided plasma torpedoes. It was a devastating barrage, one the kind that had shattered Irani cruisers and broken Dravani battle groups. Thousands of shots streaked across the void toward the human fleet. The shots hit human Ships staggered, their hulls flaring, with impacts, armor plating glowing. White hot under the assault, several smaller frigates were destroyed outright. A destroyer lost its engine section and began to tumble. The Kree gunners cheered, then the smoke cleared and the human fleet was still coming. This was the first shock. Kree weapons which could gut an Irani cruiser in 2 or 3 hits were barely denting human armor. The human ships were built differently from anything the Kree had encountered, where other species built light and fast, prioritizing speed and elegance. Humans had built heavy, and their hulls were layered with thick composite armor designed to absorb and distribute energy weapon impacts. What the CRT saw as a killing blow, human damage control teams treated as a bad day at work. Damage report, the Kree tactical officer said, his voice uncertain. Enemy fleet has sustained minor damage. They are not slowing down. They are accelerating. Accelerating. The human fleet was not pulling back to regroup, not spreading out to reduce target density, not doing any of the things that galactic military doctrine said a fleet should do when taking heavy fire. They were charging straight in. On the bridge of the Thermop, Admiral Tanaka watched the battle develop on her tactical display. With calm, steady eyes, the CFT were doing exactly what she had expected, standing off at range and trying to win with firepower. It was a good strategy against species that fought the same way, but humanity did not fight that way. All ships close to engagement range, Tanaka ordered. Fighter wings launch. The order went out and the fleet responded. 12,000 warships surged forward, engines burning at full power, crossing the gap between the two fleets at a speed the Kree found alarming. And from the carriers, hundreds of fighter bays opened simultaneously, and a swarm of small, fast, deadly craft poured into the void like hornets from a disturbed nest. The Kree had no equivalent to fighter craft. No species did. When the idea of putting a single person in a tiny ship and sending them into a battle between capital ships was considered insane by every civilization in the galaxy. The risks were too high, the survival rates too low. No rational species would ask its people to do something so dangerous. Humanity had never been accused of being entirely rational. The fighter pilots of the UNC were a special breed, men and women who had been selected for their reflexes, their courage, and what the military psychologists quietly referred to as an acceptable level of controlled insanity. They flew craft that were little more than engines and weapons with a seat bolted on. They flew them into the teeth of enemy fire with a joy that horrified observers from other species, and they were devastating. The fighters swarmed the CET fleet like insects, went too small and too fast for the big guns to track effectively. They darted between capital ships, firing missiles and rail gun rounds at point-blank range into engine ports, sensor arrays, and weapon emplacements. Kree ships that had been designed to fight enemies at thousands of kilometers suddenly found themselves being stung from meters away, and they had no defense against it. But the fighters were only the beginning. Marine assault groups go. Tanaka said this was the part that the Kree would later describe in their post-war histories as the moment they understood that humans were fundamentally different from every other species in the galaxy. Breaching pods launched from the human fleet, small armored capsules, each carrying a squad of Marines in powered exoskeleton suits. The pods streak across the battlefield and slammed into the hulls of Kree warships, their armored noses punching through exterior plating like needles through cloth. Within seconds, the pods cracked open and Marines poured into the enemy ships. No species in the known galaxy conducted boarding operations during fleet battles. It was considered impossible. The conditions were too chaotic, the risks too extreme, the logistics too complex. You could not put soldiers inside an enemy ship while that ship was actively fighting, maneuvering, and trying to blow you up. It simply could not be done. The humans did it anyway. The Marines moved through CRT corridors in tight, efficient groups, their exoskeletons amplifying their strength and speed to superhuman levels. The CRT were larger and physically stronger than humans, but they CRT were not prepared for close combat. They were a species that conquered through orbital bombardment and ground occupation, not hand-to-hand fighting. Inside their own ships, the Marines tore through them. Ship after ship went dark as human boarding parties seized control of critical systems, bridges, engine rooms, weapon control centers. Kree crews found themselves fighting a war on two fronts simultaneously, attacked from outside by the human fleet and from inside by human soldiers. It was chaos. It was terrifying, and it was working on the dominance. Warlord Draxus watched his fleet come apart. He had never seen anything like this. In all his years of conquest, he had never faced an enemy that fought with such aggression, such creativity, such complete disregard for the usual rules of engagement. On the humans did not fight like a galactic civilization. They fought like something older and more dangerous, like predators, like pack hunters, like creatures that had evolved on a world where everything was trying to kill them, and they had decided to kill it first. Warlord, we have lost 47 ships to boarding actions, his tactical officer reported. The officer's voice was no longer controlled. It was afraid. Enemy fighters are disrupting our formation. Our long-range weapons cannot engage effectively at this distance. We are taking heavy casualties. Then pull back. Draxus snarled. All ships, tactical retreat. Open the distance. The order went out. The Kree fleet began to pull away, trying to restore the long-range engagement distance where their weapons were most effective. They could not. None. Admiral Tanaka had anticipated this. She had studied the Kree for decades, and she knew that their first instinct when surprised would be to retreat and regroup. She had positioned her fastest ships, the destroyers and frigates, on the flanks, and the moment the Kree began to pull back, they swept forward and cut off the escape routes. The Kree fleet was surrounded. What followed was not a battle, it was a lesson. The human fleet closed in from all sides, pouring fire into the trapped Kree ships at ranges so close that misses were almost impossible. Fighters continued their swarming attacks. Marine boarding parties continued to seize ships. The Kree, for all their size and firepower, were being dismantled by an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. In the middle of the carnage, one moment stood out. It would later become the most famous single event of the battle, told and retold across the galaxy until it became legend. The UNC Alamo was a frigate, a small ship, lightly armed and lightly armored, designed for speed and scouting rather than frontline combat. Its commander was a man named David Owe. He was 38 years old, born in Accra, Ghana, and he had a wife and a young daughter back on Earth. He had joined the UNC because he believed in what it stood for, and he had served for 15 years with quiet distinction. During the battle, a Velari refugee convoy was detected trying to flee the planet. The convoy was a collection of civilian transports packed with survivors, families, children, elderly, making a desperate run for open space. A CF bombardment cruiser, one of the largest ships in the Dominion fleet, broke away from the main battle and moved to intercept the convoy. Its intention was clear: it was going to destroy them. Alamo was the closest human ship. Commander Owie looked at the tactical display. He looked at the refugee convoy, dozens of slow, unshielded civilian ships carrying thousands of lives. He looked at the Cree cruiser, a ship 10 times the Alamo's size, with weapons that could destroy his frigate in a single volley. He did not hesitate. "Helm, put us between the cruiser and the convoy," Owie ordered. "All weapons target that ship. Communications broadcast to the convoy. Get clear. We will hold them." The bridge crew looked at him. They understood what he was asking. Every one of them understood, and not a single person objected. The Alamo moved into position. Hitra, a tiny ship, placing itself directly in the path of a giant. The Cree cruiser opened fire. The Alamo shook. Armor plating tore away. Systems failed. Fires broke out on multiple decks. The Alamo fired back with everything it had, its rail guns and missiles hammering the cruiser. Shields, not enough to destroy it, but enough to keep its attention, enough to keep it focused on the Alamo instead of the fleeing transports. Owie's crew fought their ship with extraordinary skill and courage. Damage control teams raced through burning corridors, sealing breaches, rerouting power, keeping the weapons firing. The medical bay filled with wounded. The ship's AI reported system after system going offline. The Alamo was dying, and everyone aboard knew it. 11 minutes, that was how long the Alamo held. 11 minutes of continuous fire, of explosions and decompression, and the screams of wounded sailors, of a tiny ship refusing to move, refusing to retreat, refusing to die until the job was done. At the 10-minute mark, Owie ordered the crew to the escape pods. Most of them went, some stayed at their stations, keeping the weapons firing until the last possible moment. Owie was the last man on the bridge. He watched the refugee convoy clear the engagement zone and enter FTL safe. Every ship, every soul. He smiled. The CRT cruisers next volley tore the Alamo apart. The escape pods scattered into the debris field. Of the Alamo's crew of 112, 79 made it to the pods. They were picked up by human ships within the hour. Commander Owie was not among them. 33 crew members were lost with the ship. The refugee convoy, carrying 4,718 Vari civilians, arrived safely at the designated rally point. Every single one of them survived. Back at the main battle, the Cree fleet was finished. Ship after ship surrendered or was destroyed. The precision of the human assault was overwhelming. Tanaka had not simply thrown her fleet at the crest. She had conducted the battle like a surgeon, cutting off retreats, isolating groups of enemy ships, and destroying them one by one. It was methodical, it was efficient, and it was merciless. Warlord Draxus aboard the Dominance found himself surrounded. His flagship was the Last major Kree vessel still fighting. Its shields were failing, its weapons were running dry, and they were human. Marines on board turned the boarding party that took the dominance was led by Sergeant Major Elena Vasquez. She was a compact, muscular woman from Buenos Aires, with a scar across her jaw and eyes that had seen too much. She led her squad through the corridors of the Kree flagship with ruthless efficiency, clearing compartment after compartment until they reached the command bridge. The bridge doors were sealed. Vasquez placed a breaching charge and blew them open. Draxus was standing in the center of his bridge alone. His officers had fled or surrendered. His great conquest, the campaign that was supposed to bring the galaxy to its knees, was over. He looked at Vasquez and her Marines, these small, soft-skinned creatures in their metal suits, and he felt the feeling he had never felt before, the feeling his enemies had always felt when they looked at him, but he was afraid. Vasquez pointed her weapon at him on the ground. Now Draxus, warlord of the Kree Dominion, conqueror of 11 civilizations, got on the ground. They put him in restraints and brought him to the Thermopylae. He was dragged onto the bridge and stood before Admiral Tanaka, who looked up at the massive alien from her command chair with an expression that was not anger, not triumph, not hatred. It was nothing. She looked at him the way one might look at a problem that had been solved. She said nothing to him. She did not need to. Draxus was taken to a holding cell. He would later stand trial before the Galactic Concord for crimes against sentient life. He would never command a ship again. Outside, the battle was over. The Kree fleet was destroyed. Some ships captured, some surrendered, many reduced to drifting wreckage. The space above the Velry home world, which hours ago had been darkened by Kree warships, was now filled with human ships instead. But these ships were not firing, they were helping. The first thing Tanaka did after the battle was order the fleet's hospital ships forward. The second thing she did was order Engineering Corps to begin preparing for planetary relief operations. The third thing she did was open a channel to the surface. Ambassador Soreth, this is Admiral Tanaka of the UNC. The Kree fleet has been neutralized. Your skies are clear. We are sending medical and engineering teams to the surface. Please transmit coordinates for areas of greatest need. In the bunker beneath the ruined capital. Sarth listened to the transmission around him. His people were silent, all of them. The civilians, the officers, the children were staring at the speakers as if they were hearing the voice of a god. Lith was crying. She was not the only one. Sareth walked to the console. His hands were steady, but his voice was not. Admiral Tanaka, he said. This is Ambassador Soreth of the Velari. We receive you. He paused. He tried to find the words in English, in Velari, in any language, the right words for this moment. They did not seem to exist. Thank you, he said. Through the observation slit, Sareth could see the sky above the ruined city. The smoke was clearing, pushed aside by the wind, and through the gaps in the smoke he could see them, human dropships, dozens of them, hundreds of them, descending through the atmosphere. They were not carrying weapons, they were carrying supplies, medical equipment, food, water, shelter, materials, engineering tools. The ships that had come to make war were now coming to rebuild. Soreth watched them land, and for the first time in days, the sky above his world did not look like death. It looked like morning the first human boots touched the surface of Velar Prime at dawn. It was a strange dawn. The sun rose through a sky still thick with smoke and dust, painting everything in shades of orange and red that made the ruined capital look like it was still burning, but it was not burning anymore. The fires had been put out, most of them by Kree bombardment that had turned entire districts to ash, and by the simple fact that there was nothing left to burn. City that had once been the jewel of Velari civilization was gone. Its great towers, which had stood for 1,000 years, were reduced to broken stumps of twisted metal and shattered glass. The gardens, famous across the galaxy for their beauty, were craters. The libraries, which had held the collected knowledge of a species that valued wisdom above all things, were rubble. Streets that had once been filled with the sounds of conversation and music were silent, covered in a thick layer of gray dust that muffled every footstep. Into this silence came the humans. They came in drop ships that landed in the clearest spaces they could find, parks, plazas, the wide avenue that had once led to the council hall. The drop ships were ugly functional things painted dull military gray, and they opened their ramps with a hiss of hydraulics that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet city, and from inside came soldiers and engineers and medics, carrying everything they could carry. We, the first human to set foot on Velari soil, was a combat engineer named Corporal Maria Santos. She was 26 years old, from a small town in the Philippines, and she had never seen an alien before in her life. She stepped off the ramp, looked around at the devastation, and said a word in her native language that did not need translation. Then she put down her equipment bag, pulled out her tools, and got to work. That was the thing about humans that the Velari noticed first. They did not stand around. They did not make speeches or hold ceremonies or wait for instructions. They simply started working. Engineers began clearing rubble and setting up portable power generators. Medics established field hospitals in whatever intact buildings they could find. Soldiers fanned out to secure the area, not against the Velari, but against any remaining Kree forces that might still be hiding in the ruins. There were still Kree on the ground, thousands of them in fact. When the fleet above them had been destroyed, the Kree ground forces had been cut off. No reinforcements, no evacuation, no orders. Some of them fought, most of them did not. The Kree were a species that understood power, and they could see very clearly that the power had shifted. Human Marine units moved through the city in disciplined squads, rounding up Kree soldiers with an efficiency that was almost casual. The Kree who had marched through these same streets as conquerors just days ago were now prisoners. Ambassador Soreth emerged from the bunker on the second day. He had wanted to come out sooner, but his aides had insisted on waiting until the humans confirmed the surface was safe. When he finally climbed the stairs and stepped through the shattered doorway of what had once been the council hall, he stopped and stood very still for a long time. The world he knew was gone. The hall where he had spent decades of his life debating and negotiating was a shell. The roof was open to the sky. The walls were cracked and leaning. The great mosaic floor, which depicted the history of the Velari in tiny colored tiles, was buried under rubble and ash. But in the courtyard outside, something was happening. Group of human engineers had set up a portable water purification system, and were distributing clean water to a line of civilians. The line was long. Hundreds of people, maybe more, and they were quiet and orderly and not shuffling forward with the patience of people who had learned to wait for everything. The humans moved among them with plastic bottles and cups, speaking in a language the Velari did not understand, but in tones that were unmistakable, gentle, encouraging, kind. Sareth watched a human medic kneel beside an elderly Velari woman who had collapsed in the line. The medic was a large man with dark skin and careful hands, and he clearly had no idea how Velari biology worked. He consulted a tablet, frowned, consulted it again, and then very carefully administered water in a nutrient solution that he had to adjust 3 times before the woman's system accepted it. He stayed with her until she was strong enough to stand, then helped her to the front of the line so she would not have to wait any longer. No one told him to do that. When no order was given, he simply saw someone who needed help and helped them. Sarah watched this, and something inside him shifted in a way he could not quite describe. Over the next several days, the scope of humanity's response became clear. It was not just a military operation, it was a full-scale humanitarian mission. Transport ships arrived from human space carrying supplies, mountains of supplies, food that had been adapted to Belthari dietary needs based on the limited biological data humanity had gathered over the years. Medical equipment modified on the fly by human doctors and engineers who were learning Velari physiology in real time, making mistakes, adjusting, and getting better with every patient. Construction materials for temporary shelters, power generators, communication equipment, water, clothing, blankets. In the humans worked around the clock. They did not seem to stop. Sareth learned later that human beings required regular sleep, typically 7 or 8 hours per day. But the humans on Velar Prime were averaging 3 or 4 hours and showing no signs of slowing down. When he asked a human officer about this, the officer shrugged and said, "We will sleep when the job is done." This attitude baffled the Velari. It was not that the Velari were lazy, they were hardworking species in their own way. But they approached work with a measured, philosophical patience, believing that all things happened in their proper time. Humans seemed to believe that the proper time was right now, immediately. As fast as possible, they attacked Reconstruction the same way they had attacked the Kree fleet, with overwhelming force and relentless energy. On the 5th day after the battle, Ambassador Sareth received word that Admiral Tanaka had come to the surface and wished to meet with him. The meeting was arranged in the one place that seemed appropriate, the ruins of the council hall where the Velari had once conducted the business of peace. Sareth arrived first. He had cleaned himself up as best he could. His robes were still torn, but they had been washed, and he had found a ceremonial pin in the rubble that he attached to his collar. It was a small thing, a symbol of his office, and wearing it made him feel like himself again, even if everything else had changed. Tanaka arrived 10 minutes later, accompanied by 2 aides and a translator, and though the translator was hardly necessary, Tanaka had spent the last several days learning basic Velari phrases, and her English was clear enough for the translation software to handle the rest. She looked exhausted. Her uniform was clean but wrinkled, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many nights without enough sleep. Her hair, already going gray, seemed to have gone grayer in the past week. She was not a physically imposing person, short, lean, quiet. She looked like someone's tired mother, not the commander of the most powerful fleet in galactic history. But when she entered the ruined hall, and her eyes swept the space, taking in the destruction, the rubble, the open sky where the roof had been, Sorath saw something in those tired eyes that he recognized, not pity, not satisfaction, but something harder and sadder, an understanding of what had been lost. Ambassador Sorath, Tanaka said, extending her hand. Sorath looked at the hand. He remembered this custom, the handshake, the bizarre human greeting that involved grabbing another person's appendage and moving it up and down. It had seemed so strange 30 years ago. Now, standing in the ruins of his world, it seemed like the most natural thing in the universe. He took her hand and shook it. Admiral Tanaka, he said, you came. I told you I would, she said simply. They sat across from each other on blocks of rubble that had once been the walls of the most important building on the planet. Around them, the sounds of reconstruction filled the air, the hum of generators, the clang of metal, the occasional shout of a human engineer calling to a colleague. Through the gaps in the walls they could see Velari, civilians and human soldiers working side by side, clearing debris, building shelters, carrying supplies. Sorath studied the human woman across from him. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, patient, unhurried, waiting for him to speak. There was no arrogance in her posture, no triumph. She looked like someone who had come to do a job and wanted to make sure it was done right. He had so many questions, but there was one that mattered more than all the others. Admiral Sora said, why did you come? Tanaka looked at him with a slight tilt of her head as if the question surprised her. Sorath continued, please understand, I do not ask this out of ingratitude. What you have done for my people is beyond anything I can express, but I need to understand. Humanity had no treaty with the Velari, no alliance, no agreement of any kind. We met once 30 years ago and we paused, searching for the honest words. We were not kind to you. We told you that you were not ready for the galaxy. We dismissed you. We never contacted you again. We gave you nothing, not our technology, not our trade, not even our respect. He spread his hands, a Velari gesture of openness. You had every reason to ignore our distress call, every reason to stay behind your own borders, protect your own people, and let us face the consequences of our own failure to prepare. Instead, you sent your entire fleet across the galaxy to save a species that had treated you as beneath. Notice, you lost ships, you lost people. One, your commander, Oe, and the crew of the Alamo gave their lives for a Velari refugee convoy. His voice trembled slightly. So I must ask you, Admiral, why? What did you gain? What was the strategic calculation? What did you want from us? Tanaka listened to all of this quietly. When Sarah finished, she was silent for a long moment, looking at the rubble-strewn floor. Then she looked up at him. You asked for help, she said. Sarah waited for more. For the strategic explanation, the political calculation, the list of demands and conditions. Surely there was more. There was always more. Tanaka shook her head slightly as if reading his thoughts. Ambassador, I understand that in the Galaxy you are used to, everything comes with conditions. Alliances are transactional. Aid comes with strings attached. No one does anything for free. And I understand why you expect there to be a deeper reason behind what we did. But there is not. She leaned forward slightly. Where I come from, there is a simple rule that most human children learn before they can read. If someone asks you for help, you help them. That is it. That is the whole thing. You do not check first whether they deserve it. You do not check whether they were nice to you. You do not calculate whether helping them will benefit you. Someone is in trouble and they ask for help, and you help because that is what you do. Sora stared at her. In 300 years of diplomacy across dozens of species and hundreds of negotiations, he had never heard anything like this. It was so simple that it almost sounded naive. But looking at Tanaka's face, at the steadiness of her eyes, at the quiet certainty in her voice, well, he knew she was not being naive. She was being completely honest. But the cost, Sora said, your people died. The Alamo, the other ships you lost, the Marines who did not come home. How can you accept that cost for a species you owed nothing to? Tanaka's expression changed then. The tiredness was still there, the professionalism, the calm, but underneath it, just for a moment, Sora saw something raw. Grief, real grief. Carefully controlled but undeniably present. I do not accept it easily, she said quietly. Every person we lost has a family back on Earth who will never see them again. Commander Oe had a daughter. She is 4 years old. She will grow up knowing her father died defending people he had never met on a planet he had never visited, for a species that did not even know humanity existed a week ago. She paused, she steadying herself. That is not a cost I take lightly. It is the heaviest cost there is. But I knew, and Commander Oe knew, and every person in that fleet knew that the alternative was worse. The alternative was sitting at home safe behind our borders while your species was wiped out, living the rest of our lives knowing that someone asked us for help and we said no. She met his eyes. Humans have a long history, Ambassador. It is not a clean history. We have done terrible things to each other, wars, cruelty, betrayals that would shock you. But we have also done extraordinary things, and every time we look back at our history, the moments we are most ashamed of are not the times we fought and lost. They are the times we stood by and did nothing while others suffered. Those are the moments that haunt us, and those are the moments we swore we would never repeat. She straightened. So yes, the cost is real. And yes, I will carry it for the rest of my life, but I would rather carry the weight of the lives we lost than carry the shame of the lives we refused to save. Sarah sat in silence. For a long time, he was a diplomat. He had spent his entire life understanding motivations, reading intentions, finding the hidden agendas behind every generous offer. It was his skill, his craft, his art, and he could find no hidden agenda here, no angle, no calculation, just a simple, powerful, almost terrifyingly sincere belief that helping others was not optional. Your species, Sora said finally, is not what we thought. No, Tanaka agreed, and for the first time she smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it was real. We rarely learn. The news of what humanity had done spread across the galaxy like a wave. It moved through the shattered communication networks of the allied species, passed from ship to ship, Station to station, world to world. Velari were saved, the Kree fleet was destroyed, and the species that had done it was one that most of the galaxy had never heard of. The reactions were mixed, and they were powerful. The Yanni, whose home world had fallen to the CFT, received the news in their refugee camps and wept. They had sent no help to the Velari. They had been unable to, but they had also not tried very hard, and the knowledge that a species with no obligation had done what they could not was a wound that would take a long time to heal. The Dravani still fighting a desperate defense of their own systems. Aid received the news and felt something they had not felt in weeks. Hope. If the Kree could be beaten at Velar Prime, they could be beaten elsewhere. The Dravani commanders rallied their forces with new energy. The Nissi, hiding in their inner systems, received the news with a complex mixture of relief and shame. They were an ancient, proud species, and the knowledge that they had run while someone else stood and fought was difficult to bear. And everywhere across the galaxy, species that had never heard the word human before began to learn it. They learned about the fleet that had appeared from nowhere. They learned about the battle. They learned about the Alamo and Commander Oe and the human Marines who boarded enemy ships in the middle of a battle, because apparently that was something humans just did. They learned when, and they were impressed, and some of them were afraid. On Velar Prime, the recovery continued. Human and Velari worked together, and in working together, they began to know each other. It was awkward at first. The species were very different. The Velari were tall, thin, blue-skinned, forayed, calm, philosophical, and soft-spoken. The humans were short by comparison, varied in color and shape, loud, emotional, impatient, and constantly in motion. Communication was difficult. Customs clashed. A human engineer accidentally offended an entire Velari work crew by whistling, which in Velari culture was a sound associated with mourning. A Velari healer accidentally terrified a human patient by examining him with all four hands simultaneously, but they figured it out. They always figured it out, and because underneath the differences there was something shared, a desire to fix what was broken, to help those who were hurting, to make things better. That desire bridged every gap. One moment captured this better than any speech or ceremony. It happened on the 7th day in a makeshift shelter in what had once been a residential district. A young Velari child, perhaps 5 or 6 years old by human reckoning, had been separated from her family during the attack and had been living in the shelter since. She was small and scared and had not spoken a word since she arrived. A human Marine named Private First Class Thomas Aber was assigned to the shelter as part of a security detail. He was 23 years old, from Lagos, Nigeria, and he was built like a wall, tall, broad, with hands that could bend steel. He was also, as his squadmates knew well, the gentlest person in the entire platoon. He carried photographs of his nieces and nephews, his helmet liner, and cried at movies. Abara noticed the child on his first day at the shelter. She was sitting alone, a corner, knees pulled up to her chest, all four eyes staring at nothing. She would not eat. She would not interact with anyone. The Velari adults in the shelter had tried to comfort her, but she shrank from every touch. Aber did not approach her. He simply sat down against the opposite wall about 5 m away and began eating his ration bar. He did not look at her, he did not speak to her, he just sat there existing in her space without demanding anything. He did this every day for 4 days. He came to the shelter, sat against his wall, and ate his rations. Sometimes he hummed quietly, sometimes he read from his data pad. He never approached the child, and he never tried to make her come to him. On the 5th day, the child moved. She got up from her corner and crossed the shelter slowly and carefully, like a small animal approaching something it was not sure about. She stopped in front of Ibarra and stood there looking up at him with all 4 of her wide dark eyes. Ibarra looked down at her and waited. Child reached into the folds of her clothing and pulled out a small object, a figurine roughly made from bits